Hi, welcome to Beyond Averages, our weekly data podcast where we decode the story behind the big numbers. On today's show, we have with us Mr. Amitendu Palit to discuss India's trade deal and more on how India can go ahead with the US issues. Thank you for coming on the show, sir.
Thank you so much, Ishan, for inviting me to the show.
Mr. Palit is the research lead in trade and economics of Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. But before we go to Mr. Palit, let me delve into this issue a bit more. India's trade relation with the US until the start of the presidency of the United States was very good. We were one of the first countries to start negotiations with US President Donald Trump. And Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi seem to enjoy a good camaraderie. Over the last week, things have taken a sharp turn. US has imposed one of the highest tariffs on India compared to other economies, and India seems to be attacking India over the Russia-Ukraine war issue. To explain this more, we have a few graphs which we would like to present to you. Now, India faces 25% tariff as of now. And if you look at this chart in front of you, you would see that in dark purple color, India is one of the highest tariff facing countries, except for Canada and South Africa and a few countries in the Middle Eastern North American region. Compare this, but India is still pretty protected when you compare the effective tariff rates. This is on the 2023 trade data that we sourced from UN Comtrade. And if you look at here, the tariffs imposed on India, excluding the exemptions and other categories, would be 17.4%, while on Bangladesh, which has a 19% tariff, is 19.9%. Sri Lanka faces 19.2. But on the other hand, if you look at the Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam faces 15.9, Philippines is 13.7, Thailand is 13.3. These countries have a 19 or 20% tariff from the US under the new regime. Now, FTAs and exemptions are also helping India. The total US trade for India, that means exports, was about $80 billion. You count out the exemptions, which is on smartphones, pharma, and other categories, iron and steel, where the tariffs are flat. It's about $25 billion worth of product. UK, UAE, and Australia can cover about 19 billion here. And what we have done is we've used how much of these countries import from India and how much capacity do they have, and whether India can send to these areas. Now, US has a 50% share, over 50% share in about $10 billion worth of product, where India would not be able to find easy markets. While India has a dominant position where it exports about $4.7 billion worth of product, where its share in the US imports is about 60% or more. Look at where we can find different markets. Now, the value where you see lines are the ones where we can find easy export markets, and these are United Arab Emirates, UK, and Australia FTAs, the new ones. We're not counting Japan and South Korea there because our tariff utilization in those categories has been lower. We'll discuss that more with Mr. Palit as we go forward. Now, if you look at it, PV cells is one area where we can't find a market from either of these three countries. Cement, concrete, and artificial stones again is one market, and men's t-shirts are one market where it's difficult. But if you look at women's t-shirts, United Kingdom can emerge as a player. Taps, cocks, and walls, which are major exports, parts of these where you can find Australia and UAE both competing. Electric motors and generators, plastics and articles, all of these countries can cover those trade articles from India. But the goalposts with the US seem to be changing. India Russia relations are a flashpoint now, and President Donald Trump has been truth socialing about it a lot. If you look at his truth social posts, he's been talking about India Russia camaraderie and how that is affecting these relations. Now, until 2022, India was one of the US was a larger supplier of crude to India at about four times what Russia did. Now, the difference between the two is about 10 times, and US share has gone up over the last 2 months from about 5% in FY25 to 10%. On the other hand, Russia share seems to be coming down, but not by a big fraction. Now, Because we're talking about the US-India relationship, another aspect is how much is US dependent. You look at synthetic diamonds, and 92% of US imports come from India. Now, it's very difficult to replace countries where you have such high dependence. So, diamonds and a few other commodities we have over 40% trade dependence would be difficult to replace. Even in those where we have about 30% would be difficult because we're the largest exporter and the next exporter is about a 10 or 15 or 16. It would be difficult for them to ramp up to this stage. Now, coming back to Mr. Palit for this. Sir, are we seeing a redux from, let's start from the geopolitical point of view. Are we seeing a redux of 1990s where US was closer to Pakistan than it was to India?
Ishan, thank you firstly for inviting me to the show and then taking us through those very interesting, very useful graphics that you showed, which really describes the larger trajectory of the US India trade relationship very effectively, I thought. Now, coming to the question that you raise, look, I would like to make one thing pretty obvious at this point that I think for the United States, and right now the preoccupation of the whole world is with the reciprocal tariffs or country-specific tariffs that United States is levying on various countries. Now, this preoccupation and the levy of tariffs, not just the reciprocal tariffs, but other tariffs like Section 232 tariffs also, have been announced on the basis of the United States considering these the best way forward for correcting trade deficits. And according to President Trump and the literature that he has put out, the narrative that he has made is that trade deficits are a source of very high insecurity for the United States. So it's threatening the economic security of the US, largely because of the dependencies that it has developed for over the years. But in reality, if you just take a step back and look at this entire issue, then what we realize is that a significant number of countries which are among the US's trade partners, including India, are countries which have actually been contributing very significantly to the efficient functioning of the American economy, primarily because the American consumers are benefiting from the goods that the United States is sourcing from all over the world and at MFN tariff rates of roughly 2.5% to 4%, around that. So those low tariffs had helped the US economy enormously. But when you start using tariffs as an economic security tool, you cannot afford to have the liberty of actually using it through a trade or an economic prism, because a trade or economic prism has a different rationale. You'd actually want to keep buying from countries at cheap rates for helping your own people. But the moment you start bringing in the security narrative, you need to change the prism. And that is where the United States has taken every trade relationship as a specific binary. Every country has been treated differently. A whole bunch of tariffs has been traded off against each other. And in that process, India today finds itself engaged in trade negotiations where it is not exactly trade which is being discussed. It is a much larger context, much greater number of variables, which makes the negotiating context very complicated and perhaps brings for the ties the kind of stress which has not been experienced in several years now. And you're right, we are actually getting to see for the first time in many years that the United States is beginning to use geopolitical tools like uh, a potential oil deal with Pakistan or the Indian proximity to Russia as levers, in extracting market concessions. So to me, honestly, this is not really a trade negotiation. This is clearly a geoeconomic ploy by the United States for making countries, including India, to accept and adjust their economic policies in such a way that suits the American national security interests.
Now, sir, because you were talking about trade deficits, let me take you to another point. One of the uh, advantages of having those trade deficits and the petrodollar regime has been that US has been able to have that stability of dollar as a reserve currency for the world.
Right.
Now, when you start destroying that order,
Yeah.
does that mean that you will have no dollar will no longer be that reserve currency? And do you think this would change that paradigm of US dollar supremacy and this would start breaking it down? Because we have started over the last 2 years, we've started making those deals where it's local currency trade deals that we've done. With Russia also we are doing it, with other countries also we are doing it. So is that this moment?
Ishan, this is precisely the concern which a lot of the United States thinking currently has. And you would note that President Trump has repeatedly referred to an idea called de dollarization, and which he has been connecting with the BRICS group of countries. And in his perception, the BRICS is anti American essentially because it wants to push the dollar off from the hegemony that it holds. Now, why does the dollar hold the hegemony? And this is something which is very interesting because if we look at the United States' share in global trade, it could at best, under various kinds of estimates that we employ, not more than 15% of the global trade in goods and services. But if you look at the use of American dollar in global trade invoicing, that's a phenomenally large number, almost 60% of total global trade. And financial transactions are actually invoiced in the American dollar, which basically shows that the American dollar is considered, quote unquote, a safe haven as far as traders and operators across the world is concerned. Now, what we are getting to see is over the last 3 to 4 years, and particularly after COVID, the cost of holding on to the dollar has become exceptionally high, and large numbers of countries across the world, both big and small, are beginning to feel the pinch. So, as a result of that, they are thinking of alternative currencies. As you mentioned, it's not just India taking to dealing in trade invoicing in local currencies with certain partners, but there are also other countries who are willing to experiment in that respect. But the point, Ishan, remains that the dollar still remains a prominent currency and perhaps the most important currency in the world for trade transaction. And the reason for that is whatever alternative reserve currencies we think of, primarily from the global south, whether it be the Chinese yuan, whether it be the Indian rupee, or any other BRICS currency for that matter, they haven't yet had that capacity to be fully convertible in capital account transactions. So, as long as that shortage remains, and as long as the share in global trade remains under optimal. So, for example, if an Indian trader deals with a foreign counterpart in Indian currency, that foreign counterpart, wherever he or she based, will be holding the Indian rupee, but then he or she has to have an answer to the question that how does that Indian rupee get used in a non-Indian transaction? So I think that is basically the crux of the matter. And to my mind, a large part of this can be addressed through the interoperability of currencies that we are beginning to see across the world. And perhaps that is where the digital currencies will have a major role to play, sovereign digital currencies. Now, I don't think President Trump is really a big fan of sovereign digital currencies because to him, sovereign digital currencies actually increase the control of monetary authorities over what he would call non-sovereign digital currencies like the crypto, and he has been a big crypto fan. So this is where the interesting part comes in. The United States appears to be walking on a line where it wants to hold the hegemony of the dollar as a paper currency and a reserve currency and not commit itself to the digital currency while not allowing other currencies in their digital form to displace the dollar. Now, this is a complicated strategy, and I don't really think other countries will be really very happy with this situation. But having said that, I don't also see an overall move in the rest of the world today to completely displace the dollar till there is at least a couple of sufficient alternatives to that, which makes the traders confident and safe about the advantages of trading in alternative currencies.
Well, we'll come back to the question of crypto dollars, which is being discussed, as you would have read also, that dollar can create its hegemony again with these cryptocurrencies and with the interoperability that they provide. Also, on the yuan's aspect of becoming a global currency, given that it holds a trade surplus with many countries in the world, and there are investments aspects to it as well. But let me just veer back to India. One, the first question that arises is how important is a trade deal in today's scenario? What I covered mostly was part of the trade, which is manufacturing, which is goods. There's a large part of this that comes from services. And services, US is a major consumer of those services, and it can tax companies that are establishing their GCC bases in India and all. So, where do we stand from the services trade aspect? If Trump starts going after it, would we be in much larger pain? Two, how important does a trade deal become within that paradigm then?
I think, Ishan, that's actually a very fundamental point which has been overlooked because the entire conversation on tariffs has totally been centered around the issue of manufacturing and manufactured goods. And as you very rightly say, there is a very considerable part of trade which is in services. Now, as such, if one looks at the numbers, then global trade in services is right now just under one third of global trade in manufacturing. But from a US India perspective, this trade is a significant trade. And that is a trade where the United States has a very important role to play. And honestly, I don't think the United States, under any circumstances, however much President Trump is, creative in that regard in terms of thinking of new protections, I don't think he's really going to work on that segment of the India-US trade simply because that benefits a huge amount of American companies, particularly the American tech companies. Now, there are already certain amounts of resistance that are building up domestically within the United States, particularly as far as the tech companies are concerned, because the tech companies are, companies like Amazon and Walmart, for example, are quite unhappy over the fact that the de minimis threshold has been taken off, which means basically even small value parcels coming into the United States are going to be impacted by tariffs and customs inspection. But the bigger question over here is that if the tech companies are looking at India as a market for greater global integration and the services which they provide to the rest of the world, then is that something which the American thinking would want to maintain and preserve? My view on that is it certainly will. Because if we look at the global capability centers in India and the fact that there are almost 2,000 of them in India now, most of them are owned by the Fortune 500 companies. And the important point is that they're great sources of repatriation of capital surplus and profits back to the United States. Where Mr. Trump is likely to raise a point is that if it is a question of digital service taxes and similar measures which would see national taxation authorities treating digital enterprises as extrajudicial territorial entities and taxing them the way they would have taxed had they been located in their own territories, that is where he would want to step in. But to me, this issue was actually well sorted out during the earlier Biden regime itself through the base erosion profit system and the minimum alternate tax of 15%. I don't think India will really, have an offense to this. But the other important point, Ishan, over here is that I think India is in a sweet spot when it comes to services. Because if you look at the trade in services and one component in services, which is digitally delivered services, today, India is the fourth largest exporter of digitally delivered services in the world after the United States, UK, and Ireland. That is a very strong position to hold. And I think this is where the US India service positioned synergies have worked very well, particularly financial, IT, consultancy, and professional services areas. I don't really see President Trump, muddying waters in this territory.
On the trade deal part,
Yeah.
how important does a trade deal become within this aspect? Because when we say President Trump might not go for it, there's a big might there, given that he has been known to upend global order as it stands. So, from that perspective,
Yeah.
how important is a trade deal?
I don't think what the countries are getting into with the United States are trade deals at all. These are just some agreements on paper on mutual exchange of tariff rates. There's nothing by way of comprehensive trade elements which are coming up in the free trade agreements. These are not even free trade agreements. So whatever agreements countries are entering into the US, because if you look at India's parallel trade deals, for example, the one that India has just signed with the United Kingdom, which I personally describe it as an Ivy League free trade agreement because of its comprehensive character and the depth of market access commitments on both sides, and the liberalization that India has offered on various areas where it has never stepped in before. Nothing of that is going to come in any trade deal with the United States by any country, except some tariff adjustments and purchase commitments on side of the partners. So I don't really think that for India this is going to make an exceptionally different and difficult condition, because if the trade deal doesn't happen, reciprocal tariffs remain on India at 25%. And if we go back to the April 2nd order, which had issued reciprocal tariffs, there were a whole bunch of items which were exempted from the reciprocal tariffs. This is not to say that Indian exports will not be impacted. Yes, to some extent they will, particularly some of the graphics that you showed out there. Items like James and jewelry, for example. James and jewelries are going to be impacted because James and jewelry flow into the American market in very large numbers because of the large Indian diaspora and their demand in the northern American continent. Similarly, some leather and garments and so on and so forth. But we don't have tariffs on pharmaceuticals yet, and that is a path, that is a sector which President Trump himself will have to trade very delicately, because if the drug costs increase for local consumers, it's not going to really be a very stable situation for him as he goes into the midterms. So I honestly don't think that India should be stretching itself too much in agreeing to some of the very heavily geopolitical demands which are coming from the United States. I mean, for example, if you look at some of the demands that might be coming in government procurement, we have extensively opened up government procurement in the free trade agreement with the UK, with the exception of the defense procurement. Now, it's not really plausible for India, or for that matter, any country, to open up defense procurement market formally to foreign suppliers. Even the United States doesn't do that. I mean, even there in defense procurement, the domestic enterprises have the first priority. So I don't really see what is the great economic logic in India being anxious over the fact that it has not been able to reach a deal with FDA. And I'll just end with one example. If you compare with Vietnam, and many people have brought in the Vietnam example as arguable competitors for India, Vietnam is now sitting with a 20% reciprocal tariff. The point over here, Ishan, is that Vietnam has also got a 40% transshipment tariff, and it has not got exemptions from Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium and automobiles. So
Yeah.
who's better off at the end of the day and who is worse off? I think the jury will not be out in the foreseeable future on these market access balances and counterbalances, and I don't really think India should be too anxious to conclude a deal.
So can we delay this for 4 years? Can we brave this storm for 4 years and just hope for a
So,
more
yeah,
aligned presidency?
that's a very interesting question, Ishan. Let's take a step back, and look at the first Trump presidency. What happened during the first Trump presidency was India lost the GSP. And there were other countries also, along with India, which lost the GSP. Thailand, Turkey, many of them lost the GSP. Uh, then, towards the end of the Trump 1.0, India and the US were very close to agreeing on a bilateral trade deal, which did not get materialized due to a variety of reasons, ostensibly COVID and so on and so on. Then came the Biden administration, and the Biden administration never brought up a free trade agreement in any of its conversations with any trade partners. Instead, it talked about 21st century solutions to new generation issues. But what the Biden administration did was that it was able to work out a lot of existing trade problems with India, which saw a very sharp reduction in the number of disputes India and the US had vis-a-vis each other at the WTO, and trade facilitation improved very significantly. Now, Trump 2.0 comes back with this whole idea of reciprocal tariffs and using tariffs as an economic security tool, as a geo-economic tool. Point that I would like to make over here, Ishan, is that, you know, trade has always been a sticky issue between India and the United States, whether it be the Biden administration, whether it be the former Obama administration, and of course, not talking about the Trump administrations. Trade has been a sticky issue between the US and India, much as it has been a sticky issue even between US and its defense partners like Japan. I mean, Japan is still holding on to the rice and beef market. So is Korea. So I think there are issues which are very difficult to resolve between countries that are as big as US and India. These issues will remain, irrespective of which American administration comes to power. But there is one important point here. You know, if we look at the relative market sizes, today the American economy is roughly $30 trillion in size, followed by China, which is around 20 trillion. Then below that, you have India, Japan, and Germany sitting pretty close to each other in the $4 to $8 trillion bunch. The point, Ishan, over here is that the economic distance between US and China and the rest of the countries is considerably large. I think before India decides on whether to, go into a deal with the US full-fledged, India needs to first look at very carefully what are its options. As far as foreign engagement is concerned, I'm glad you brought out those graphics on diversification. India has to think of much greater diversification of its exports and not just manufacturing, primarily services. And that is the goal which should guide the idea of a deal with the US, whether with Trump or 3 years later with another administration.
Let me ask you, because you've brought out the part about which are the top countries in the world and how the world is aligned also. Let me ask, how prudent is a non-alignment strategy in today's paradigm where one of the global powers or aspiring to be global powers is very close to our borders and we have had border issues with them. And two, the US is very transactional in its approach, right? They may just favor China or on a transactional issue rather than favoring India, keeping in mind the geopolitical scenarios. So how important it is to be non-aligned, or do we need to now align to a bloc given that the war has come closer to our home? The Cold War has come closer to our home, I must say.
I think this is a fundamental, understanding which requires to be absorbed by the Indian establishment, and not just the Indian policymakers, but those in India who are engaged in business, strategic forecasting, and even the common Indian. Because what you say is absolutely correct. If you look at the power dichotomy in the world today, and as we were just mentioning, the United States and China are commanding the kind of strategic influence that they can because of their economic might. China can afford not to succumb to the US because it can simply put the export controls on rare earths. That will have the United States, taking a couple of steps backward, allowing the Nvidia chips to be going through, and so on and so on. The point, Ishan, is that India is yet to reach that position of having substantially high economic capacities, which will enable it to exert that geo-economic influence in order to ensure that it doesn't need to be aligned. I think non alignment is not really the way forward. What is required is an effective policy of multiple or multi alignment. That doesn't necessarily mean political alignments. I think for India, it is important to choose, and I guess it has been doing so for quite some time now, to choose that what are the points of cooperation that it should have with countries, including the United States and China. And working with one does not mean not working with the other. I think that's an important realization that needs to be absorbed at this stage, that there could certainly be benefits that one can see by working with China on certain areas, as well as working with the United States on certain other areas and Russia on certain other areas. And India is the best judge of those. But there is one final point, Ishan. I think today in the world, India has a certain reputation, along with a certain number of other countries, that India has been committed to global rules and global frameworks, so as to say. And when you look at global public goods and their management, the best example is that of climate change and so on and so forth. India has never shown a tendency to run away from global rules, in spite of its pressing need. It will stay committed, whether it be the global south, whether the rest of it. I think there is an expectation that India will stay committed to the global rules framework, whether that global rules framework need to be reinvented in certain other ways. And I think, to me, what is probably becoming likely is that India, along with a coalition of like-minded middle powers, you know, they could be the United Kingdom, they could be the Brazil, they could be Canada, they could be Indonesia, a large number of other countries drawn from the global south and the global north, both, all of whom are equally uncomfortable with the way the US China hostilities are shaping out and the fact that they can take care of each other, we cannot. The simple point being that today countries are doing deals with the United States, but sooner or later, China will be coming back to these countries and saying that, look, what you have dealt with the US does not mean that I get a raw deal at the end of the day from your export preferences for me. So you need to look after me, bro, as well. I mean, that's important. So I think this is where it is important to look for some alternative rulemaking space. And perhaps I don't see why India should not contribute that. India is the fourth largest economy in the world today with this much amount of command and influence, and people do look forward to India. So I think the time has come, and I think India has started taking concrete steps. The FTA with the UK, though that with Australia, the one with the European Union, are very big and strong examples of India's commitment to new generation issues, and India should just continue that progress.
So some of the old politics needs to come back where parties could align together with each other, regardless of what. Some of those old politicians also need to come back, most likely, probably. But let me ask a question from the rules-based order perspective, and this is the
Yeah.
last question that I was asking of you, because we're running out of time. So usually we've seen wars have led to emergence of new orders. We have a trade war in tow as of now, as we are talking, right? Where countries, although they are agreeing to what the US is saying, are also disagreeing within themselves. The European Union is a classic example of this, where France has now expressed disagreement or displeasure over the trade deal that, over the trade agreement that has been finalized between the two uh, regions. Within that paradigm, can India really take the lead in establishing a new trade or world order? Because WTO, as it seems, is very out of touch with the realities of what exists today. Or would it be an alteration of the current world order itself that we would see within this paradigm that is emerging soon?
Ishan, I have two examples that I wanted to share with you. One is, if you look at the last BRICS summit that got concluded in Rio, the Rio summit probably produced a BRICS communique which one has never seen from the BRICS earlier before, in terms of the depth, the coverage, the details, and also in its criticism of the United States and its policies without naming it. Now, the fact of the matter is that this is a summit which didn't have President Xi joining. This is a summit which also didn't have Vladimir Putin joining from Russia. It was by and large the handiwork of the host Brazil, the most important other founding member India, and some of the new members, which essentially shows that if India wants to commit itself seriously to a constructive and purposeful alternative global order development, it can very well do that. It can work with a number of like minded countries, because today India is not just a simple developing country anymore. India is a country which is developing in certain respects, but extremely modern and forward positioned in a large number of other respects with respect to the capacities that it has. And I think India is well positioned to play that role. The only challenge for India is to make it very clear to the rest of the world that it is willing to play that role, and in a constructive and purposeful manner, because there are alliances, coalitions, frameworks across the world which are showing signs of tear and wear. And I think that is something which is a matter of concern for all these frameworks. You mentioned European Union. There are issues emerging in Southeast Asia. There are issues emerging in Latin America as well. So I think this is where a country like India, which has, for all practical purposes, a constructive agenda, not a destabilizing agenda, is something which needs to be shared with the rest of the world. And if it's a question of working on common subjects with common rules, then there is no reason why India cannot contribute.
One last question. I'm sorry, I'm extending this by how important is CPTPP or RCEP agreements within this paradox? Now that India has shown, as you said, with the UK agreement, a willingness to let go of certain sectors, auto being one of them, we allowed trade quotas there. How important do those agreements become? Because we were having this discussion and somebody was saying, and they were rightly pointed out, the agreements that you're doing with economies are economies that are growing 1%, 1.5%. You need to look east again and look at economies that are growing 5.5%, 6%, and do agreements with them. So how important does that become?
Let me share this with you stylistically, Ishan. If you look at RCEP, India has a free trade agreement today with all members of RCEP, or is this in the process of concluding it? I think the only party left is New Zealand, except China. And obviously, with China, the question of a free trade agreement doesn't arise for a variety of reasons. If you look at CPTPP, again, it's a broadly similar situation. India practically has free trade agreements with all CPTPP members. Canada, Australia, UK, the Southeast Asian members. We are working on FTAs with Chile, Peru, Malaysia, everything. I mean, it's just under them. And today, India is working on a free trade agreement with the European Union. The European Union is discussing with CPTPP closer alignment of rules, including digital trade rules. So, doesn't all this, in many respects, make India a very natural fit for CPTPP? And mind you, I'm not mentioning RCEP because I think India's commitments have gone well beyond the reform ambition of RCEP. RCEP, in that respect, if you compare it with India's FTA with the UK, is a much less ambitious agreement. India doesn't need to look at RCEP anymore. But India definitely needs to look at CPTPP because that's a far more different grouping in terms of its composition, in terms of its ambition. And honestly, I think if India is able to take a clear position of how to handle investor protection rules, then India today is tailor-made for CPTPP. There was a view at one stage when CPTPP first came up that it is too ambitious, too high standard for India to touch. Well, the situation definitely is very, very different today. So I think the CPTPP is an important agreement because it comprises those countries which are really committed to global rules and which would want to look at trade in a beneficial and productive way for bringing more benefits to people, not by shutting people out of trade. And I think India is clearly a signatory to that pledge and it should engage strongly with the CPTPP.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for your time. It was great having you as always. Would love to have you again as the situation develops and as we evolve with more trade agreements coming in the line. European Union is one where we are trying to move. It was great to have you. Thank you again for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Ishan. Lovely speaking with you as always. Look forward to being back with you again.
Thank you. India's move with the US is somewhat peculiar in the sense as to it is still holding out to what US has done. Can it hold out longer? Professor Palit believes it can to a certain extent. As far as other trade agreements are concerned, India is doing well to offer a buffer or a protection to itself when it comes to these countries. Thank you for watching Beyond Averages. We'd love to have you again next week discussing more trade issues and more geopolitics, understanding from experts as to where India can go from here and where does it fit in this geopolitical alignment. Thank you for watching.